At the dawn of the 5th century, the Roman Empire, once a bastion of stability and power, found itself stretched to its limits. The mighty empire, besieged by internal decay and external invasions, could no longer sustain its grip on its farthest provinces. Among those was Britannia, a land at the empire's very edge, isolated by the turbulent waters of the English Channel and the rugged frontiers of Hadrian's Wall. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome had shaped the island with its governance, infrastructure, and military might. Roads crisscrossed the landscape, connecting thriving towns and fortified cities. Roman laws, customs, and trade networks had brought a semblance of order to a previously fragmented land of warring tribes. But by the early 400s, the situation had changed dramatically. Rome's heartland was under siege. Barbarian tribes such as the Visigoths and Vandals swept through Europe, and the empire's resources were increasingly drained in a desperate bid for survival. As a result, Britannia, a province once prized for its resources and strategic position, became less of a priority. The legions, once a symbol of Roman authority, were systematically withdrawn to bolster defenses closer to Rome. The final blow came in 410 CE when Emperor Honorius issued his infamous rescript to the cities of Britain, informing them that they could no longer rely on the empire for military or administrative support. This withdrawal marked a seismic shift for the people of Britain. For centuries, they had depended on the might of Rome to repel threats from the northern Picts, the Irish raiders, and even internal dissent. Now, without the disciplined legions, they were left to fend for themselves. Roman governors and local leaders struggled to maintain control, but the infrastructure of governance began to unravel. The intricate Roman systems of taxation, law enforcement, and defense could not be sustained in the absence of centralized support. The cities, once bustling hubs of Roman culture, began to deteriorate. Villas and bathhouses fell into disrepair. Roman fortresses, long bastions of security, were abandoned or taken over by local warlords. The Romanized elite, accustomed to the privileges of empire, found themselves vulnerable in this new world, forced to either adapt or vanish. For many common Britons, the withdrawal of the legions meant a return to tribalism and local power dynamics, where survival often depended on forming alliances and defending against opportunistic neighbors. Moreover, the absence of Roman authority created a power vacuum that would become a stage for new players. Invaders from across the North Sea, Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, saw the weakened state of Britannia as an opportunity. Meanwhile, the Picts to the north and Irish raiders to the west increased their incursions, further destabilizing the region. The withdrawal of the Roman legions was not just a military event. It marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Britain's identity. The loss of Roman protection exposed the fragility of the societal structure Rome had imposed. What followed was a period of struggle and reinvention, as Britain grappled with its newfound autonomy amid the chaos of the collapsing Western Roman Empire. With the Roman legions gone and the once unifying presence of the empire shattered, Britannia became a land of uncertainty and danger. The sudden vacuum of power left its towns and rural settlements vulnerable to threats from all sides: marauding Picts from the north, Irish raiders from the west, and opportunistic invaders from across the sea. Amid this chaos, a new kind of leader began to emerge. Local warlords, tribal chiefs, and influential landowners who sought to fill the void left by Rome. These leaders, often ambitious and ruthless, became the linchpins of their communities. Unlike the Roman governors and officials who had relied on the empire's bureaucratic structure, these new rulers wielded power through personal loyalty, force of arms, and strategic alliances. They were not united in their goals or methods. Some sought to emulate the Roman way of governance, attempting to maintain the traditions and infrastructure left behind. Others reverted to tribal customs, prioritizing kinship ties and local autonomy over the broader political stability that Rome had enforced. Among the most notable of these leaders was Vortigern, a name that has echoed through history and legend. Vortigern is often depicted as a king or overlord who rose to prominence during this period of instability. He is remembered both for his attempts to consolidate power and for the controversial alliances he forged. According to historical and semi-legendary accounts, Vortigern invited Saxon mercenaries to Britain to help defend against the Picts and other threats. While this decision may have provided short-term relief, it also set the stage for long-term conflict, as these Saxons eventually turned against their hosts, seeking land and power for themselves. The rise of local leaders like Vortigern highlights the adaptive nature of Britons in the post-Roman era. Without the centralized administration and military backbone that Rome had provided, communities had to rely on whatever resources and leadership were available. Fortified settlements, or hill forts, became crucial centers of power, offering refuge and a base of operations for these emerging rulers. These leaders often surrounded themselves with personal retinues of warriors, small but loyal bands of fighters who could enforce their authority and protect their territories. In addition to defense, local leaders played critical roles in maintaining some semblance of economic and social order. They collected taxes, or their equivalent in goods and labor, maintained roads and fortifications as best they could, and managed disputes among their subjects. In some cases, they sought to preserve elements of Roman culture, such as literacy, law, and Christianity, though the extent of this effort varied widely across the region. However, the rise of local leaders was not without its challenges. Power struggles were frequent, as rival chiefs and warlords vied for dominance. Alliances were often fleeting, forged out of necessity rather than loyalty, and betrayals were common. This fragmentation made it difficult for any single leader or group to establish widespread control over Britannia, creating an environment of near-constant conflict and instability. While these local leaders provided critical support and defense for their communities during a time of uncertainty, their influence was limited by the fractured nature of post-Roman Britain. They were the architects of a new political landscape, one defined not by the overarching authority of an empire, but by the shifting dynamics of power between competing factions. This period of localized rule set the stage for the larger struggles to come, as new players, including the Saxons and other Germanic peoples, began to stake their claims to the land. In the wake of the Roman withdrawal, the beleaguered Britons faced a growing number of external threats. Among the most formidable were the Saxons, a Germanic people whose reputation for seafaring, raiding, and warfare preceded them. Initially, the Saxons were not invaders but allies, mercenaries invited by local British leaders, most notably Vortigern, to help defend the crumbling province against the persistent attacks of the Picts and other northern tribes. Yet what began as a strategic alliance would soon spiral into a struggle for control, as the Saxons established a foothold in Britain that would transform the island's history forever. The Saxons, along with other Germanic tribes like the Angles and Jutes, came from the regions of present-day Germany and Denmark. These tribes had long been familiar with the shores of Britain, having conducted raids on Roman settlements even during the height of the empire's power. With the Roman military absent and local defenses weakened, the Saxons saw an opportunity not only for plunder, but for settlement. They were drawn by Britain's fertile lands, temperate climate, and the promise of a new life far from the crowded and contested territories of their homeland. At first, the arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. The Saxons provided much-needed military support, repelling northern raiders and securing key territories for their British patrons. In return, they were granted land and resources. However, the relationship was fraught with tension. The Saxons were a fiercely independent people, loyal to their own leaders rather than to the British warlords who employed them. Their warrior ethos and cultural differences often clashed with the more Romanized Britons, creating friction that would only grow with time. The turning point came when the Saxons, dissatisfied with their pay and treatment, turned against their British hosts. According to tradition, this betrayal began with a dispute over resources, as the Saxons demanded more land and supplies than the Britons were willing or able to provide. What followed was a period of bloody conflict, as the Saxons began to carve out territories for themselves, seizing lands in the south and east of Britain. These areas, rich in farmland and strategically located near the coast, became the foundations of early Saxon settlements. The Saxon foothold was not established overnight. It was the result of decades of warfare, negotiation, and migration. The Saxons brought their families with them, creating permanent settlements that transformed the landscape. They built timber halls, farmed the land, and established local communities that operated independently of the British rulers. Over time, these settlements grew into small kingdoms, each ruled by a Saxon chief or king who exercised authority over his people and the surrounding territory. The establishment of Saxon power also marked a significant cultural shift. The Saxons brought with them their own language, customs, and religious beliefs, which began to supplant the Romanized culture of the Britons in the areas they controlled. Paganism, with its pantheon of gods like Woden and Thor, replaced Christianity in many regions, leading to a cultural divide between the Saxons and the native Britons, who clung to their faith and traditions. The Saxons' growing presence in Britain was not uncontested. The native Britons fought fiercely to resist their advance, rallying under leaders such as Ambrosius Aurelianus and, in legend, King Arthur. These conflicts, often referred to as the Saxon Wars, were brutal and protracted, with victories and defeats on both sides. Yet despite the resistance, the Saxons continued to expand their territories, laying the groundwork for what would become the kingdoms of Wessex, Sussex, and Essex. As the Saxons established their foothold, the balance of power in Britain began to shift irrevocably. The island was no longer a unified province under Roman rule, but a fragmented land divided between native Britons and incoming Saxons. This division would shape the course of British history for centuries to come, as the struggle between these two peoples played out in a land torn between its Roman past and its Saxon future. The Battle of Badon Hill stands as one of the most pivotal and mysterious events in the turbulent history of post-Roman Britain. Though shrouded in legend, it is remembered as a moment when the native Britons achieved a critical victory over the encroaching Saxons, temporarily halting their advance and offering a glimmer of hope in a dark and uncertain time. The battle not only represented a key military triumph, but also became a symbol of resilience and unity for a people fighting to preserve their land and identity. The exact location of Badon Hill and the details surrounding the battle remain subjects of intense debate among historians and archaeologists. Some theories place it in southwest England, near Bath, while others suggest locations further north or along the Welsh borders. Despite this uncertainty, what is clear is the significance of the battle in stemming the tide of Saxon expansion. By the late 5th century, the Saxons had established a firm foothold in eastern and southern Britain, with their settlements growing into fortified strongholds. Their dominance seemed inevitable as they continued to push westward, displacing native Britons from their lands. Faced with the Saxon threat, the Britons rallied under a leader whose identity remains enigmatic. Some accounts attribute their success to Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romanized Briton hailed as a defender of his people. Others link the battle to the legendary King Arthur, a figure whose existence has been endlessly debated, but whose symbolism as a unifying and heroic leader endures. Whether Arthur, Ambrosius, or another figure led the Britons at Badon Hill, the leader's ability to inspire and organize resistance was instrumental in turning the tide. The battle itself is described in only a handful of historical sources, most notably by the 6th century monk Gildas and later by the 9th century Historia Brittonum. According to Gildas, the Britons achieved a resounding victory at Badon Hill, inflicting significant losses on the Saxons and forcing them to retreat. This victory marked a rare moment of unity among the Britons, who, despite their tribal divisions, came together to defend their homeland against a common enemy. The tactics employed by the Britons are largely speculative, but likely involved a combination of guerrilla warfare and traditional Celtic battle techniques. The rugged terrain of Britain would have favored the defenders, allowing them to ambush and outmaneuver the Saxon forces, who were less familiar with the landscape. The use of fortified positions, such as hill forts, and the Britons' intimate knowledge of their surroundings would have given them a critical advantage. The victory at Badon Hill had profound consequences for the trajectory of British history. For several decades after the battle, the Saxons' advance was stalled, and a fragile peace settled over much of the island. This period, sometimes referred to as the British Renaissance, allowed the native Britons to regroup, rebuild, and preserve elements of their culture and traditions in the face of growing Saxon dominance. It also provided a foundation for the legends that would later emerge, portraying this era as a heroic struggle against overwhelming odds. The battle's legacy is most famously immortalized in Arthurian legend. The image of Arthur as a warrior king leading his knights to victory at Badon Hill has captured the imagination of generations, blending history with myth. While the historical Arthur, if he existed, may have been a warlord or military leader rather than a king, his association with the battle underscores its significance as a turning point in the struggle for Britain. Despite its celebrated status, the Battle of Badon Hill did not mark the end of the Saxon threat. It was instead a temporary reprieve, a moment when the Britons proved that they could resist and even defeat a powerful and determined foe. Yet, the battle's psychological impact was immense. It demonstrated that the Saxons were not invincible and inspired hope among the Britons that their homeland was not yet lost. The memory of Badon Hill would echo through the centuries, influencing the narratives of chroniclers and storytellers alike. Whether viewed as a historical event or a mythical tale, it remains a powerful symbol of defiance and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The departure of the Roman legions from Britain not only left a political and military vacuum, but also fractured the cultural cohesion that had been maintained during Roman rule. Britannia, once a province that blended native Celtic traditions with Roman law, governance, and infrastructure, began to splinter into distinct cultural identities. The Romanized elite, native Britons, and incoming Germanic tribes each struggled to assert their own ways of life, creating a patchwork of competing cultures that would define this era. Under Roman occupation, many Britons had adopted aspects of Roman culture. Cities like Londinium, London, and Eboracum, York, thrived as centers of trade, education, and governance. Roman villas dotted the countryside, and Latin became the language of the elite and the church. Christianity had taken root, spreading through the province and offering a unifying spiritual framework. However, the Roman cultural influence had never been universal. In rural and remote areas, Celtic traditions persisted, blending with Roman practices in unique ways. When Roman authority collapsed, these fragile cultural balances were upended. The Romanized towns and cities, now bereft of resources and leadership, quickly declined. Roads that had once connected the province became difficult to maintain, and the trade networks that had brought goods and ideas to Britain disintegrated. With the collapse of these systems, the Romanized Britons faced a profound identity crisis. Many clung to their Roman heritage, attempting to preserve Latin literacy, Christian teachings, and the remnants of Roman law. However, without the central structure of the empire, these efforts were localized and often short-lived. Meanwhile, the native Britons in more rural regions, who had always maintained a stronger connection to their Celtic roots, began to reassert their traditions. Tribal structures re-emerged, and ancient customs, languages, and spiritual practices found new vitality. While some Romanized Britons and Celtic Britons sought common ground, the pressures of survival often exacerbated divisions. These cultural disparities were further complicated by the arrival of new groups, the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, who brought their own distinct customs and beliefs. The incoming Germanic tribes introduced a starkly different way of life. They were largely pagan, worshipping gods like Woden, Thor, and Freya, in contrast to the increasingly Christian Britons. Their social structures revolved around kinship and loyalty to local chieftains, emphasizing personal bonds over the legalistic frameworks of Roman and Celtic traditions. The Saxons' language, Old English, began to take root in the territories they controlled, further distancing these areas from the Latin and Celtic tongues spoken by the native Britons. This period of cultural fragmentation was not merely a coexistence of diverse groups, but often a clash of values and traditions. Religious conflict, in particular, played a significant role in shaping the era. Christian Britons viewed the pagan practices of the Saxons as a threat to their faith and moral order, while the Saxons, in turn, saw Christianity as alien and imposing. The result was a cultural battleground where religious and linguistic identities became markers of political and territorial allegiance. Despite the divisions, there were instances of cultural exchange. Saxon settlers adopted some Roman practices, such as coinage and rudimentary urban planning, while Britons in Saxon-dominated regions occasionally assimilated into Germanic society. However, these exchanges were limited, and the broader trend was one of separation rather than integration. The fragmentation also had profound implications for the artistic and intellectual life of the period. The loss of centralized Roman influence meant that Britain became a cultural backwater compared to the flourishing Byzantine Empire or even the Frankish kingdoms in Europe. Manuscripts, religious texts, and other written works became scarce, as the infrastructure to produce and disseminate them disintegrated. Oral traditions took on greater significance, preserving stories, myths, and histories that would later form the basis of national identities. The cultural fragmentation of post-Roman Britain was not merely a byproduct of the era's political instability. It was a driving force that shaped the land's future. The distinct identities that emerged during this time laid the groundwork for the development of separate kingdoms and cultural regions. Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall retained much of their Celtic heritage, while the Saxon-dominated territories began to forge a new Anglo-Saxon identity that would evolve into medieval England. This fragmented cultural landscape reflected both the challenges and the resilience of a society navigating the collapse of empire and the dawn of a new age. Christianity in turmoil. The collapse of Roman rule in Britain dealt a significant blow to the stability and spread of Christianity, a religion that had gradually gained prominence during the later centuries of Roman occupation. By the time of the Roman withdrawal, Christianity had become well established in urban centers, with bishops, churches, and monasteries playing crucial roles in both spiritual and civic life. However, as the administrative and military structures of Rome disintegrated, so too did much of the organized framework that had supported the Christian Church. The decline of Roman authority left the Christian communities in Britain vulnerable. The bishops, who had once acted as intermediaries between the local population and the Roman government, lost their influence and resources. Many Christian leaders found themselves unable to maintain their positions or protect their congregations, particularly as the invading Saxons brought with them pagan beliefs that clashed with Christian doctrine. The urban churches, which had been centers of worship and education, fell into disrepair, and the fragile network of communication between Christian communities began to crumble. Compounding these difficulties was the isolation of Britain from the rest of the Christian world. With the severing of ties to Rome, British Christians were cut off from the theological debates, ecclesiastical councils, and broader support networks that continued to shape the church on the continent. This isolation led to the emergence of a uniquely insular form of Christianity in Britain, heavily influenced by the traditions and practices of the Celtic regions. Celtic Christianity, as it came to be known, developed its own distinctive characteristics during this period. Rooted in the monastic tradition, it emphasized spiritual discipline, the veneration of nature, and a deep connection to local communities. Monasteries became the heart of Celtic Christian life, serving not only as places of worship, but also as centers of learning, art, and cultural preservation. Figures such as St. Patrick, who is credited with spreading Christianity to Ireland, and St. David, the patron saint of Wales, emerged as pivotal leaders in this localized Christian tradition. However, the rise of Celtic Christianity did not mean that the faith was universally embraced across Britain. The Saxon invasions brought with them a revival of pagan practices, which flourished in the territories they controlled. The Saxons worshipped a pantheon of gods associated with war, fertility, and nature, and their rituals often clashed with Christian teachings. For the Britons who remained in these areas, practicing Christianity became an act of resistance, a way to assert their identity in the face of cultural and religious upheaval. The tension between Christianity and paganism was not confined to spiritual matters. It had profound social and political implications as well. Christian leaders sought to strengthen their influence by forging alliances with local rulers, offering spiritual legitimacy to their authority in exchange for protection and support. In some cases, this strategy succeeded, leading to the establishment of small Christian enclaves even within predominantly pagan regions. In others, it backfired, as pagan leaders viewed Christianity as a foreign and divisive force. Despite these challenges, Christianity endured and, in some areas, even thrived. Monasteries, particularly in the Celtic regions of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, became beacons of learning and cultural preservation during this turbulent time. Monks dedicated themselves to copying manuscripts, preserving not only Christian texts but also remnants of Roman and Celtic literature. These efforts would prove invaluable in safeguarding the intellectual heritage of Britain, even as the land was plunged into chaos. The perseverance of Christianity during this period was also aided by the emergence of charismatic leaders and missionaries who worked tirelessly to spread the faith. Figures like Saint Columba, who established the influential monastery at Iona, and Saint Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the Anglo-Saxons in the late 6th century, played crucial roles in reviving and expanding the Christian presence in Britain. However, the seeds of division were also sown during this period, as differing practices and interpretations of Christianity began to take root. The Celtic Church and the Roman Church, which sought to reassert its influence over Britain in the following centuries, would eventually clash over matters of doctrine, liturgical practices, and authority. These conflicts foreshadowed the complex relationship between the British Isles and the wider Christian world, a dynamic that would continue to evolve for centuries. In the midst of turmoil, Christianity in post-Roman Britain became a story of resilience, adaptation, and transformation. While it faced significant challenges from within and without, the faith endured, reshaping itself to meet the needs of a fragmented and embattled society. Its survival laid the foundation for a renewed Christian revival in later centuries, as missionaries and leaders sought to bridge the divides and bring a sense of spiritual unity to a divided land. As the Saxons continued their incursions into Britain during the 5th and 6th centuries, the native Britons were forced to mount a desperate resistance. Their struggle was not only a fight for survival, but also a battle to preserve their land, culture, and identity in the face of relentless aggression. At the heart of this resistance was a figure shrouded in both history and legend, Ambrosius Aurelianus. His name would become synonymous with the Britons' efforts to push back against the Saxons, and his leadership would leave a lasting legacy that resonated across generations. Ambrosius Aurelianus, as described by the monk Gildas in his 6th century work De Excidio et Conquesta Britanniae, was a Romanized Briton of noble lineage. Gildas portrays him as a man of modest character and great leadership, standing as one of the last links to the Roman world in a Britain rapidly succumbing to chaos. Ambrosius's Roman heritage set him apart from the predominantly Celtic Britons he led, but it also provided him with the organizational skills, military acumen, and charisma needed to unite a fractured people. According to tradition, Ambrosius emerged as a leader during a time of great despair, when the Britons were reeling from repeated Saxon victories. Entire communities had been displaced, their lands seized, and their people forced into servitude or exile. The Saxon advance seemed unstoppable, and morale among the Britons was at its lowest ebb. It was in this dire context that Ambrosius rallied the Britons, forging alliances among rival tribes and galvanizing them into a cohesive force capable of resisting the invaders. Ambrosius's campaigns against the Saxons were marked by a series of battles, the most significant of which culminated in the legendary Battle of Badon Hill. While details of this battle remain sparse, its outcome, a decisive victory for the Britons, demonstrated the effectiveness of Ambrosius's leadership and strategy. The victory temporarily halted the Saxon advance, providing a much-needed reprieve for the Britons and instilling hope that their homeland was not yet lost. The Ambrosian legacy extended beyond the battlefield. As a leader, Ambrosius worked to maintain some semblance of the Roman order, preserving elements of Roman law, governance, and military discipline within his territories. This effort helped to stabilize the regions under his control and provided a framework for resistance that outlasted his lifetime. While many Britons had reverted to tribal systems in the absence of Roman authority, Ambrosius's example showed that unity and organization were still possible. Ambrosius also played a role in fostering cultural resilience. He was a staunch defender of Christianity, which was under threat from both the pagan Saxons and the decline of Roman infrastructure. By supporting Christian leaders and institutions, he helped to ensure that the faith remained a unifying force among the Britons, even as the Saxons sought to impose their own religious practices on the lands they conquered. While Ambrosius's life and deeds are rooted in historical accounts, they also gave rise to a rich tapestry of legend. Later chroniclers and storytellers, seeking to imbue their tales with a sense of heroism and continuity, often linked Ambrosius to the mythical figure of King Arthur. In some accounts, Ambrosius is portrayed as Arthur's predecessor or mentor, a wise and noble leader who laid the groundwork for the legendary king's exploits. Whether or not such connections are historically accurate, they underscore the enduring impact of Ambrosius's legacy on the collective imagination of Britain. Ambrosius's leadership was not without challenges. The Britons he united were a deeply divided people, with tribal rivalries and regional loyalties often threatening to undermine their resistance. To maintain cohesion, Ambrosius had to navigate a delicate balance of diplomacy, persuasion, and at times force. His ability to hold this fragile alliance together was a testament to his skill as a leader and his unwavering commitment to the cause of his people. The resistance led by Ambrosius was not merely a series of military engagements. It was a broader struggle to reclaim and redefine what it meant to be British in a post-Roman world. By standing against the Saxons, Ambrosius and his followers sought to preserve a way of life that was rapidly slipping away, even as they adapted to the harsh realities of their time. Their efforts, though often overshadowed by later events and figures, were crucial in shaping the identity and destiny of Britain during a period of profound transformation. Ambrosius's death, the circumstances of which remain unclear, marked the end of an era. Yet his legacy lived on in the stories, traditions, and values of the Britons who continued to resist the Saxons long after his passing. He became a symbol of unity and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, leadership and determination could inspire a people to fight for their survival and their future. The Anglo-Saxon settlements. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons in Britain marked a transformative and tumultuous period in the island's history. Initially invited as mercenaries to defend against other raiders in the wake of Roman withdrawal, the Saxons, alongside the Angles and Jutes, soon became settlers, carving out territories and altering the cultural and political landscape of Britain. Their settlements were not merely an influx of new inhabitants, but a reshaping of the very fabric of British society, creating a divide between the native Britons and the newcomers that would endure for generations. The earliest waves of Anglo-Saxon migration began in the mid-5th century. These groups, originating from what is now modern-day Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, arrived in a fragmented Britain. The lack of centralized Roman authority made the island vulnerable to both external and internal pressures, allowing these new settlers to exploit its weakened defenses. At first, the Saxons were employed as foederati, military allies who would fight on behalf of British leaders in exchange for land and provisions. However, as they grew in strength and numbers, they turned from allies to conquerors, seizing the very lands they had been invited to defend. The process of settlement often involved violent conflict. The Saxons established control over fertile lowlands and river valleys, driving the native Britons westward into regions such as Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria. These forced migrations created a stark cultural and geographical divide, with the Britons retaining their Celtic traditions and the Saxons imposing their own Germanic culture on the territories they dominated. This displacement was not merely physical, but also cultural, as the Saxons began to erase or repurpose Roman and British sites for their own use. The settlements themselves reflected the Saxons' distinct way of life. Unlike the Romanized towns and cities, Anglo-Saxon communities were predominantly rural, centered around villages and agricultural estates. These settlements were built with practicality in mind, consisting of timber-framed houses that were often arranged in a circular or linear pattern. At the heart of these villages was the mead hall, a communal space that served as a center for governance, feasting, and storytelling. The mead hall was not only a physical structure, but also a symbol of Saxon society, emphasizing loyalty to a chieftain and the importance of kinship bonds. Social organization within Anglo-Saxon settlements was hierarchical, with a clear distinction between free men, bondsmen, and slaves. At the top of this hierarchy were the orals, nobles, and ceorls, freemen, who held land and provided military service. Below them were the theo, slaves, who worked the land and served the needs of their lords. This stratified system was deeply rooted in the values of loyalty and reciprocity, with leaders expected to protect and reward their followers in exchange for their allegiance. The Saxons' pagan religion also played a central role in shaping their settlements and culture. Shrines and sacred groves were common features of their landscape, reflecting their veneration of gods such as Woden, Thor, and Freya. These deities were associated with natural forces, war, and fertility, and their worship was deeply intertwined with daily life. Seasonal festivals and rituals provided a sense of community and continuity, reinforcing the bonds within their settlements. Despite their initial hostility toward Christianity, the Saxons' eventual conversion to the faith would further shape their settlements and society. By the late 6th and early 7th centuries, missionaries such as St. Augustine and St. Aidan began to establish churches and monastic centers within Saxon territories. These institutions not only facilitated the spread of Christianity, but also introduced elements of Roman literacy, art, and governance back into Anglo-Saxon culture. The Anglo-Saxon settlements were not uniform. They evolved over time, reflecting the changing dynamics of their society. As the Saxons consolidated their control over Britain, their territories grew into larger political units known as kingdoms. Early settlements expanded into regional centers of power, forming the foundations of future Anglo-Saxon kingdoms such as Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. These kingdoms often competed with one another, leading to cycles of alliance and conflict that further shaped the landscape of Britain. Trade and interaction with neighboring cultures also influenced Anglo-Saxon settlements. Coastal communities engaged in trade with the continent, importing goods such as wine, cloth, and weapons. These interactions introduced new ideas and technologies, blending with indigenous practices to create a unique Anglo-Saxon identity. Archaeological evidence, such as the treasures unearthed at Sutton Hoo, highlights the sophistication of their craftsmanship and the wealth that some settlements amassed. The Anglo-Saxon settlements marked a pivotal shift in Britain's identity. Where the Romans had built cities and roads as symbols of imperial unity, the Saxons brought a decentralized and agrarian way of life that emphasized local governance and cultural autonomy. Their arrival introduced a new language, Old English, which began to replace Latin and Celtic dialects in the regions they controlled. This linguistic shift was accompanied by changes in law, art, and religious practice, leaving an indelible mark on British history. Though their initial arrival was marked by violence and displacement, the Anglo-Saxon settlers laid the groundwork for the development of a new societal structure in Britain. Their villages and kingdoms would become the precursors to medieval England, blending their Germanic traditions with the remnants of Roman and Celtic heritage. The story of their settlements is one of adaptation and transformation, reflecting the broader struggles and triumphs of a society emerging from the shadows of a fallen empire. Rise of new kingdoms. The collapse of Roman rule and the subsequent waves of migration and settlement across Britain created a fragmented political landscape. In the absence of a centralized authority, new power structures began to emerge, leading to the rise of distinct kingdoms. These nascent states, forged in the crucible of conflict and survival, became the foundation for the Britain that would follow. The development of these kingdoms was marked by shifting alliances, fierce rivalries, and a complex interplay between the native Britons, the invading Anglo-Saxons, and other groups vying for dominance. Initially, the withdrawal of Roman administration left Britain divided into smaller tribal territories. Local chieftains and warlords filled the power vacuum, ruling over fragmented communities and vying for control of land and resources. These leaders were often drawn from the remnants of the Romanized elite or the traditional Celtic tribal hierarchy, and their authority was based as much on personal charisma and military success as on lineage or inheritance. As the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes established their presence, these smaller territories began to coalesce into larger political entities. The new Anglo-Saxon rulers brought with them a different style of governance, one that emphasized kinship, loyalty to a leader, and the consolidation of power around fortified settlements. The creation of defensive strongholds that served as centers of administration and military organization, allowed these emerging kingdoms to secure their territories and project their influence outward. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the map of Britain had begun to take on a more defined shape, with several prominent kingdoms rising to prominence. Among the native Britons, regions such as Gwynedd in present-day Wales, Strathclyde in what is now Scotland, and Dumnonia in the southwest resisted the encroaching Saxons and maintained their cultural and political independence. These kingdoms often drew on their Celtic heritage, preserving traditions, languages, and social structures that set them apart from the Anglo-Saxon-dominated territories. In the Saxon-controlled regions, the establishment of kingdoms like Kent, Sussex, Wessex, and East Anglia marked the beginning of a new political order. These kingdoms were often ruled by warrior kings who claimed descent from legendary ancestors, using myth and lineage to legitimize their authority. Over time, the smaller Saxon polities were absorbed into larger, more powerful entities, such as Mercia and Northumbria, which would dominate the political landscape of early medieval England. The process of kingdom building was not confined to the Anglo-Saxons. In the north, the Picts and Scots carved out their own territories, often in direct competition with each other, and with the Britons of Strathclyde. The Irish also played a significant role, with settlers from Ireland establishing the Kingdom of Dalriada in western Scotland and exerting influence over the surrounding regions. These overlapping claims and conflicts contributed to a dynamic and ever-changing political map. The rise of these kingdoms was driven by a combination of factors, including military conquest, strategic alliances, and economic development. Warfare was a constant feature of this period, as rival leaders sought to expand their territories and assert their dominance. Success in battle often determined a kingdom's survival, with powerful rulers like Ethelfrith of Northumbria and Penda of Mercia emerging as key figures in the struggle for supremacy. Economic factors also played a role in the consolidation of power. Control of trade routes, agricultural land, and natural resources allowed certain regions to flourish, giving their rulers the means to support larger armies and more complex administrations. The development of coinage in some Anglo-Saxon kingdoms further facilitated trade and economic integration, laying the groundwork for a more interconnected society. Religion was another important element in the rise of new kingdoms. The spread of Christianity, particularly in the 6th and 7th centuries, provided rulers with a powerful tool for unifying their subjects and legitimizing their authority. Missionaries such as St. Augustine and St. Aidan worked to convert both rulers and their people, establishing churches and monasteries that became centers of learning and cultural exchange. The adoption of Christianity often marked a turning point in the development of a kingdom, signaling its integration into a broader European cultural and political framework. However, the rise of these kingdoms was far from a linear or peaceful process. Internal divisions, succession disputes, and external pressures often destabilized even the most powerful states. The shifting balance of power between rival kingdoms led to periods of intense conflict, such as the struggles between Mercia and Northumbria for dominance over central and northern England. These rivalries not only shaped the political landscape, but also influenced the cultural and religious development of the region. Despite these challenges, the rise of new kingdoms in post-Roman Britain laid the foundation for the medieval world. The political structures, social hierarchies, and cultural identities that emerged during this period would endure for centuries, shaping the character of Britain and its people. The kingdoms of this era were not merely the products of conquest and consolidation. They were also the crucibles in which new traditions, alliances, and identities were forged. These early kingdoms, though fragmented and often at odds with one another, represented a new chapter in the history of Britain. They were born from the chaos of a collapsing empire and the influx of diverse peoples, yet they managed to establish a degree of stability and continuity that would define the island's future. The story of their rise is one of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring human drive to create order out of chaos. Cultural transformation and identity. The cultural transformation that occurred in Britain after the fall of Roman rule was profound and multifaceted. With the departure of Roman administrators, soldiers, and officials, the island's previously unified Romanized society fractured, giving way to a complex tapestry of indigenous, Celtic, and newly arrived Anglo-Saxon influences. This period of upheaval led to a significant redefinition of British identity, as various groups sought to reshape their communities, traditions, and cultural expressions in the face of changing circumstances. The loss of Roman infrastructure, roads, cities, administrative centers, and trade networks, left many regions isolated and vulnerable. Without the centralized governance of Rome, local communities were forced to adapt to their new environments, developing new ways of connecting with the land, each other, and the broader world. This often meant a return to more localized, tribal, or familial bonds, as communities turned inward for support in the absence of imperial oversight. Celtic culture, which had been marginalized during the Roman occupation, saw a resurgence during this time. Celtic traditions and customs, deeply connected to the natural world, flourished in regions like Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, and Ireland. The Celtic people retained their rich oral traditions, storytelling, poetry, and druidic rituals, which emphasized a strong connection to the land, nature, and ancestry. These practices became integral to local identities, giving a sense of continuity and resilience amidst the broader societal shifts. In contrast, the Anglo-Saxon settlers brought a distinct Germanic cultural influence, which was characterized by a warrior ethos, communal gatherings, and a focus on kinship ties. Their mythology, social structures, and art were rooted in a different worldview, emphasizing honor, bravery, and the importance of the leader-follower relationship. The mead halls, central hubs for feasting, storytelling, and governance, symbolized this warrior culture, creating a shared sense of identity among the Saxon tribes. The blending of these two distinct cultural influences created a hybrid identity in many regions, one that reflected both the resilience of Celtic traditions and the new Germanic practices of the Anglo-Saxon settlers. This fusion gave rise to a unique British identity, where individuals navigated between their local roots and the larger, more encompassing Anglo-Saxon or Christian influences that began to dominate the political landscape. Christianity played a critical role in reshaping cultural identity. With the rise of the Church, particularly in the later 6th and 7th centuries, Christian practices began to supplant many traditional Celtic and pagan rituals. Monastic communities and bishops became centers of learning, art, and cultural preservation, fostering the spread of literacy, education, and Roman Christian values. The establishment of churches, abbeys, and Christian festivals helped to establish new social structures, shaping communities around shared spiritual and moral beliefs rather than solely on tribal or familial ties. However, this cultural shift was not universally accepted. In regions where pagan traditions remained strong, such as parts of northern England, Scotland, and Wales, resistance to Christianization persisted. The struggle between traditional beliefs and Christian teachings led to periods of cultural tension, marked by conflicts between Christian missionaries and local pagan leaders. This struggle continued to influence cultural expression, often blending older rituals with Christian elements or adapting Christian holidays to local customs. The importance of language also played a significant role in the transformation of cultural identity. As Anglo-Saxon settlers integrated into the British landscape, Old English gradually supplanted Latin and Celtic languages in many regions. This shift influenced not only communication, but also the formation of laws, poetry, and literature. Old English poetry, with its rich oral tradition and focus on heroism and morality, became a central part of the Anglo-Saxon cultural identity, preserving stories of gods, battles, and the shared experiences of warriors and kings. Art and craftsmanship further reflect the cultural fusion of this period. Anglo-Saxon metalwork, with its intricate patterns and interlaced designs, blended Germanic influences with Celtic motifs. Objects such as brooches, sword hilts, and jewelry displayed both artistic innovation and functional design. Meanwhile, the preservation of Roman art and architecture in Christian monasteries and churches introduced classical elements into Anglo-Saxon culture, creating a synthesis of styles that would be seen in the region's subsequent medieval art. Political divisions also influenced cultural identity. The rivalries between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria often drove cultural innovation as rulers sought to distinguish their regions from others. This competition manifested in literature, architecture, and the development of regional laws, with each kingdom seeking to promote its unique heritage while asserting its dominance over rival territories. Ultimately, the cultural transformation of post-Roman Britain was characterized by a blending of older traditions and new influences. While Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Christian elements all played significant roles in shaping identity, it was the dynamic interplay between these forces that defined this period. British identity became a fluid concept, shaped by both local heritage and the broader cultural currents sweeping across the continent. This fluidity laid the groundwork for the medieval societies that would rise in the centuries to come, blending the rich legacies of multiple traditions into a unified, yet diverse, cultural landscape. Struggles for survival. The period following the fall of Roman Britain was one of intense upheaval and uncertainty. With the Roman withdrawal in the early 5th century, the island found itself adrift, bereft of the centralized authority that had maintained relative stability for centuries. This left the native Britons, as well as the newly arriving Anglo-Saxons and other groups, to grapple with the harsh realities of survival. The struggle was not merely against external threats, such as the relentless push of the Anglo-Saxon invaders, but also against internal divisions, environmental challenges, and the erosion of established systems of governance. For the native Britons, the loss of Roman protection was catastrophic. The Roman occupation had provided them with infrastructure, a legal system, and a sense of unity that had kept the various tribes and regions connected. Without this support, the island became fragmented, and communities were forced to adapt to the loss of security and resources. Many Britons fled to the remote regions of Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland, seeking refuge from the increasing dominance of the Saxons. Yet even there, survival became difficult as they faced relentless incursions from the advancing Anglo-Saxon settlers. In the Anglo-Saxon territories, the situation was similarly precarious. While these settlers initially came to Britain in search of land and opportunity, the harsh realities of frontier life meant that they were constantly engaged in territorial disputes and the need to defend their settlements. Harsh winters, limited agricultural output, and the need to establish new systems of governance further strained their capacity to thrive. Warfare became a means of securing resources and expanding territories, with communities often engaging in brutal skirmishes to secure land for farming, hunting, and settlement. Furthermore, both the native Britons and Anglo-Saxons had to adapt to a landscape that was slowly changing. The Roman infrastructure that had once supported trade and communication was disintegrating, leaving towns and cities in disrepair. Roads were overgrown, communication became more localized, and economic life had to be rebuilt from the ground up. With no reliable central government, people turned to local leaders, chiefs, warlords, and kings, who rose from the chaos to fill the power vacuum. These leaders were tasked not only with defending their communities, but also with creating new systems of order amidst the uncertainty. The struggle for survival also extended to religious and cultural identity. Both the native Britons and the Anglo-Saxons sought to preserve their distinct ways of life in the face of rapidly changing circumstances. For the Britons, maintaining a Celtic identity was crucial, despite the overwhelming influence of the Anglo-Saxons. They preserved their language, customs, and oral traditions, which provided a sense of continuity even as the Romanized world faded away. Similarly, the Anglo-Saxons sought to assert their cultural dominance, blending their Germanic traditions with the existing Christian framework and asserting their dominance over the land they had claimed. Environmental challenges only exacerbated the struggles for survival. Harsh weather, dwindling resources, and unfamiliar terrain made life difficult for both groups. Settlements were frequently raided, crops were lost to poor soil or harsh winters, and trade routes were irregular and insecure. Coastal communities, especially, were vulnerable to Viking raids, which would begin to intensify in the 8th century. These external pressures forced communities to develop new strategies for survival, from fortifications and military alliances to new agricultural techniques and local economies that prioritized self-sufficiency. Leadership became essential during this time, as warlords and kings emerged to guide their people through the uncertainties. Their ability to organize and lead was often determined by their skill in warfare, diplomacy, and resource management. Dynasties rose and fell as leaders struggled to maintain control over their territories, while maintaining the loyalty of their followers who relied on them for protection and stability. The constant state of flux meant that alliances were formed and broken with ease. Kingdoms often shifted in size and influence depending on their leaders' ability to forge connections with other tribes, negotiate peace, or wage war. This fluid political landscape required communities to constantly adapt to new circumstances, ensuring that survival remained a collective, ongoing struggle. Ultimately, the struggle for survival during this period was not just a physical battle, but an emotional and cultural one as well. Both native Britons and Anglo-Saxons sought to preserve their identities and ways of life in the face of adversity. Despite the challenges, communities managed to endure through resilience, resourcefulness, and the will to protect what they held dear, whether that was their land, their traditions, or their very sense of self. The period left a legacy of adaptability, marking the foundations of a society that would continue to evolve through centuries of change and hardship. Legacy and long-term impact. The period after the fall of Rome and the subsequent wars for Britain left a profound and lasting legacy that shaped the region's history for centuries to come. From the establishment of new kingdoms to the blending of cultures, the effects of this era extended far beyond the immediate challenges of survival and conflict. The foundations laid during this transformative period influenced the social, political, and cultural development of Britain, contributing to the eventual emergence of medieval England and shaping the identities of its people. One of the most significant legacies of this era was the formation of new political entities, or kingdoms, which began to dominate the British landscape. These early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, such as Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Kent, not only established the groundwork for a more centralized governance, but also laid the foundations for regional identities that would persist into the later medieval period. The rivalry and cooperation between these kingdoms created a dynamic political landscape that required strategic alliances, warfare, and cultural exchange, leading to a rich tapestry of influences that would shape English history. The blending of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Christian influences produced a unique cultural identity that endured well beyond the initial period of conflict. The preservation of Celtic traditions, alongside the introduction of Germanic customs and Christian teachings, created a distinct British culture that was distinct from other parts of Europe. This fusion of identities contributed to the development of a new social order in which language, art, law, and religious practice reflected a diverse and interconnected heritage. Moreover, the military and social structures that emerged during this time had a lasting impact on the development of feudal systems, which would later dominate medieval England and much of Europe. The rise of chieftains and warlords transformed into a more formalized aristocracy, where power and land were distributed in exchange for military service and loyalty. This system not only reinforced local control, but also paved the way for greater political unity and hierarchical governance under kings and lords. The spread of Christianity played a crucial role in shaping the long-term legacy of this period. Monasteries became centers of learning, culture, and artistic expression, preserving and transmitting knowledge that spanned generations. The introduction of Christianity helped unify much of Britain under a common faith. Although regional variations of Celtic, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon Christianity continued to coexist for centuries. The Christianization of Britain influenced laws, customs, and societal expectations, creating a moral and ethical framework that would shape the social fabric of medieval England. Economically, the post-Roman period marked a shift from a largely Romanized urban economy to a more localized, rural-based system. Small agricultural communities became the norm, and new trade networks began to form, often connecting regions through rivers, coastal routes, and regional hubs. The development of markets and the exchange of goods such as metalwork, textiles, and food helped sustain the kingdoms, fostering a more diverse and self-sufficient economy that persisted into the medieval period. In terms of legal and administrative systems, the early kingdoms laid the groundwork for future governance. The emergence of local law codes, such as those attributed to figures like Ethelbert of Kent, contributed to the development of early Anglo-Saxon law, which influenced later English legal systems. These laws reflected a blend of traditional tribal customs and emerging Christian principles, highlighting the complex interaction between secular and religious authority. The Anglo-Saxon period also left a substantial linguistic legacy. Old English, a language that evolved during this time, became the foundation for modern English. As communities settled and integrated over generations, the various Germanic and Celtic dialects converged into a more standardized form, creating a language that would become the primary medium of communication, literature, and governance in medieval England. Culturally, this period enriched British heritage with a variety of traditions that have had lasting significance. The poetry, literature, and oral histories from this time, such as those preserved in texts like Beowulf and other Old English sagas, serve as invaluable historical documents. These literary works reflect the values, struggles, and achievements of the societies that emerged after the fall of Rome, providing a glimpse into a world that defined much of Britain's historical identity. Despite the challenges, the legacy of the wars for Britain and the transition from Roman rule to Anglo-Saxon dominance ultimately shaped the trajectory of the nation. The unity that began to form between tribes, kingdoms, and regions laid a foundation for a more cohesive identity that would evolve into the medieval kingdoms of England, Scotland, and eventually Great Britain. The enduring impact of this period can be seen in the social structures, cultural traditions, and political institutions that continue to influence modern British society.